I would like to welcome all of you to today. Very grateful for you guys to show up and give us your time this summer, especially when all of us are so busy with other things, whether we're tending to animals or we're having to farm, or even holding another job. It can be challenging to get on and get some of this information. I just wanted to remind you that this is a monthly webinar. We do it every second Wednesday of the month. We have different topics and try to rotate through as many topics as you guys are interested in. So if you do have some topics you would like to hear about, please feel free to give us those suggestions, and we will either try to talk on those ourselves, our collaborators, or we will try to find specialists in those fields in order to talk about them in more depth. Not with us today, but will be joining us shortly, is Dr. Ellison, Melinda Ellison from the University of Idaho, Carmen Wilmore, who's also from the University of Idaho Extension, Dr. Whit Stewart, who's from the University of Wyoming, is one of our collaborators, and then also, lastly, myself. So I am Chad Page. I currently work as the Utah State University sheep and goat specialist. Today, I wanted to talk a little bit about something that we've talked about before on this webinar, but I wanted to talk about again as we're in those summer months and as we're raising animals. I wanted to talk a little bit about sheep predators and some control solutions for these predators. Okay, this is a pretty big issue in the sheep industry. As my beef counterparts like to tease me a lot here at the university, that everything is looking to go out and eat sheep. And so it's important for us as producers to try to figure out ways to mitigate that predation and depredation of our animals. So I also wanted to point out that there's been a lot of really good research that has happened over the years. One research project out of Oregon, done by Ronaldo Cook back in 2013, they actually looked at the influence that predation experience had on animal behavior and stress response. And so what they did is they actually took two different groups of cows, one group of cows that had been exposed to wolves before in Oregon, and then one group of cows that was novice to any type of predator like that. And so they put these animals in a dry lot setting, and then they exposed them to wolf urine, and also they walked a German Shepherd, pictured here on the right-hand side. They walked a German Shepherd to kind of simulate that wolf by the pens of these animals. Now, these pictures are pretty strong. They say pictures are worth a million words, and I really think that is true. If you look at this picture here, you can see these animals that are really crowding each other, highly stressed. You can see one of them is flexing, pushing into the group as much as they can, whereas the other group that had never been exposed to predators before is fairly still well placed out. Their heads are up normal. They're not turned away from the German Shepherd as it passes by their pen. And so you can also see that these animals have pretty much gone to the very back corner. And so what I really wanted to illustrate with this is even that prior experience of being around predators has some long-lasting effects on our livestock. If it's not purely out of depredation and loss of animal life, we could be experiencing loss and growth of our animals, and that they're a constant state of stress. And so that's something to think about, whether or not you're in an urban area and your sheep and goats are constantly getting, dogged by different animals walking by, or maybe you're out on range and there's a constant threat of predators, whether it's wolves or bears or coyotes that we'll talk about later. So I thought this did a really good job illustrating that point. Here's a very recent story that just happened that kind of proves that point, right? And so recently in Idaho, a little over 100 sheep, so 143 sheep, both ewes and lambs, were crowded by 2 gray wolves into a ravine area, and actually crowded so hard that they suffocated. And so these animals were stressed out. None of them were consumed by the wolves in this particular incident, but it goes to show you that intense stress response really can be devastating. With some of the higher prices that we did have in the sheep industry, and then some of that has slipped down a little bit in the last couple months, but that would be a pretty devastating loss to lose that many animals. But this just goes to show that predation in all of its forms really is one of the driving losses in the sheep industry. So what is a predator? So the Merriam-Webster dictionary actually defines predator as an organism that primarily obtains food by killing and consuming of other organisms, okay? And so oftentimes with sheep and goats, we think of predators as coyotes or some kind of carnivore that is preying on our animals. So we have things like bears, so grizzly bears, black bears. Oftentimes signs of bears are that they like to flip those ewes over, and oftentimes they'll eat out the mammary tissue of those ewes, and that's kind of a telltale sign of bears, versus coyotes or mountain lions or anything of that sort. We also have raptors, especially here in the West and across the plains. Raptors can be pretty devastating on livestock in general. Another thing that actually fits into this definition that I couldn't not think about when I read the definition was parasites. I mean, they're essentially an organism that primarily obtains their food by killing and consuming our sheep and goats. And so I throw up a picture of the barber pole worm, and we won't get into parasites today, but I thought it was fitting for the definition. And then lastly, man's best friend, right? Sometimes our cute dogs, Fido next door, can sometimes be the cause of a lot of aggravation when it comes to killing our livestock and killing our sheep and goats. So these are just some of the predators to think about. There are many, many more. In Texas, they deal with hogs. They deal with feral hogs, which is something I'm not super familiar with, but is a growing issue, and things like that. So if we looked at some older numbers, back in 2010 is when this graph was made, but it kind of gives you an outline of a bunch of the different types of predators that are preying on our sheep. And so coyotes really far and away are the biggest killers of sheep and lambs across the US. Recent numbers that have just come out in the last year or so from the USDA and Wildlife Services have shown essentially the same percentages of losses from coyotes, dogs, bears, mountain lions. And so it's all pretty interesting on what type of predator really attacks a certain type of sheep or lamb based on how old they are. And so bears, you see that they, for the most part, they consume a lot of lambs. And then coyotes, they actually consume more lambs than sheep, whereas bears consume more sheep than lambs percentage-wise. Bobcats and lynx are a pretty big issue. Domestic dogs are probably the second biggest killer of sheep, other than coyotes, but coyotes still roughly 5 times the amount that even our domestic dogs will kill. Mountain lions are pretty high up there, and then eagles or our raptors on lambs are pretty devastating also. Okay, so You can see that, some of those predators like wolves or foxes, sometimes desert foxes were an issue when I lived in Arizona. Um, they're not quite as big an issue industry-wide across the United States compared to coyotes. So if we look at some of the monetary impact that coyotes in general are having, here's a couple states across the Western US, the region that I'm in, but these numbers stay pretty true across the United States, and we'll kind of see why that is in the next slide. In the state I'm in Utah, you can see that over 26,000 sheep and lambs were lost due to coyotes back in 2020. So that's roughly 62% of all predation was due to coyotes in Utah, roughing over $3 million that particular year. You can see that across the other states are also large numbers, high percentages ranging generally from 50% to around 70% as far as the number of sheep and lambs killed by coyotes versus other predators. So, but man, looking at those dollar signs really adds up. So as I've met more and more sheep producers across the US on the East Coast, we all pretty much deal with coyotes, okay? I think sometimes in the West, we start thinking, oh, well, we have all these predators here, and we do have some big predators, grizzlies and wolves and things like that can be really devastating based on even that article I showed earlier. But coyotes have really expanded their rangeland over the last couple of centuries. So historically, they were found more in maybe the plains areas and across some of the Southwest desert. But as maybe some of the other, influence from other predators went down across the US, coyotes have really expanded their territory really across the whole of the United States and up into Canada quite a bit. We're also seeing some of these animals that are crossing with wolves. And so now we're dealing with, some coyote wolf hybrids. Sometimes they call these coy wolves. And so that's another aspect that we're starting to deal with coyotes. So coyote removal and population. This is one thing that is so fascinating to me about coyotes, is that coyote population really responds to hunting and removal. So as we remove more animals, it allows the resources that were once taken up by those animals for greater success rate in living for those wolf pups. So there's a couple graphs here I wanted to kind of show. This first graph here in the middle, we see the number of coyotes at breeding, okay? And as we hunt these animals, okay, so let's say we kill off around 50% of these animals, we can keep them at a pretty low rate. As we kill off 75% of these animals, we can bring down these populations pretty low. But as soon as we remove this control, as soon as we stop hunting these animals, oftentimes we'll see these populations bounce back to where they originally were. And so there is some research that suggests that, even hunting coyotes, oftentimes what will happen is that population size will stay roughly the same. And what you'll do is you'll actually change the dynamics of the age of that population of coyotes, which is represented in this graph, these graphs here on the right-hand side. So this graph kind of shows the age of the animal, or coyotes in this instance, across, so how many years old they are. And then it also does it by whether they are unexploited or there was no removal of coyotes, lightly exploited, or highly exploited. So if we were not to really remove any coyotes from this population, you see that average age is a lot higher than if we looked at that exploited, highly exploited, or we could look at this at highly removed number of coyotes or hunted number of coyotes. you'll see that that population didn't necessarily change drastically, other than we just killed off a lot of the older animals. It opened up resources for more of these younger animals to live in their litters that they were born in. And so we kind of shifted the dynamics of those animals. Now, this kind of opens up a pretty big debate, I think, amongst some sheep people. It's not a debate amongst many. Some people say the best coyote is a dead coyote. Some people say that if you have coyotes in your area, but they're not killing sheep, then don't hunt them. Don't kill off that generation of coyotes that has not figured out or is unwilling to kill your sheep or your goats in your area. And I think based on some of this science that shows how their population responds to hunting, that may be a pretty valuable thing to learn. And that, maybe some coyotes in your area, if they're not doing you any harm, maybe you keep them so that they're not replaced with potentially coyotes that are willing to depredate and willing to hunt your animals. And so kind of something fascinating to think about, and something to kind of take into debate of how you want to manage predators, specifically coyotes in your area. So some of the other predators that we deal with, raptors being a pretty big one. Know that there are laws based around poisoning some animals. I've heard of people, poisoning some raptors, and those things can end badly. So make sure that you know the laws in your area and what you can and can't do as far as taking care of these predators. Ravens are also a really big one that, time and time again, newborn lambs that are left alone, that aren't, taken care of quickly. Oftentimes these ravens will fly down and they'll sometimes peck out the eyes. And I don't mean to be graphic or anything, but they'll peck out the eyes, or they'll kill these lambs, and then they're left to be, and then the ravens can scavenge on those carcasses. So kind of switching gears a little bit, I wanted to kind of talk about something, and I represented this in Utah and Wyoming based on the number of small farms. So we're kind of seeing in the sheep industry, well, sheep, really farms in general, we're seeing that the number of farms that are between kind of 1 and 9 acres, they're really on the rise. And the overall average size of the farm, at least in these Western states, and I believe this to probably be true across the whole of the US, is that we see the average farm size decreasing by quite a bit. So here we have a whole new slew of people who are coming into maybe raising sheep and goats, since they have smaller amount of acreage, and they're doing it on smaller acreage, 1 to 9 acres, maybe a little bit more than that. And they're wanting to do it in a sustainable manner. But that usually puts them fairly close to maybe some urban areas and things like that. So another survey that was just put out by some of our colleagues at South Dakota State University found that roughly 51% of the people that they surveyed had less than 50 sheep. Quite a few people had been doing it less than 10 years. But many of these people were holding a secondary job or a primary job, and raising sheep and goats is their secondary. And so for a lot of us, we're running kind of smaller operations. We're trying to figure out how to do this on smaller acreage, and it's kind of new to us, right? Which kind of brings us to our next predator in a sense. So we talked about coyotes, a little bit about wolves and raptors and things like that, but oftentimes in more urban type areas, some of the biggest issues that we'll deal with are domestic dogs. Where I grew up in Arizona, stray dogs or domestic dogs from people that may live, a mile or a couple miles down the street, these oftentimes were the animals that killed the most number of sheep or chickens that we had. And even though we did get, coyotes, and we got, hawks and desert foxes coming in off the desert, domestic dogs was probably still our biggest issue, based mainly on that kind of urban area that we surrounded ourselves by. So we have all these predators. In some joking way, many things are out to get our sheep, right? So what do we do about it? There's really two main things that you can categorize everything into, either lethal control or non-lethal control. So lethal control being trapping, snaring, hunting, taking care of these animals by eliminating the life of that predator. I would highly suggest that you reach out to wildlife services in your state. I'm trying to think of the percentage off the top of my head, but I want to say about 70% or more of large sheep operations that have 1,000 or more sheep work actively with federal agencies and like wildlife services to help them with their predator issues. Okay, and so I'm not going to be going into really any depth on lethal predator control, but what I'm going to talk a little bit more about today is the non-lethal aspect of predator control. And so there are a lot of things we can do in this category, more than what I'm obviously going to talk about today. But fencing is one of them, whether that be night corrals, electric fencing, woven wire, things like that. Shed lambing, maybe you want to switch your production setting in order to make things a little bit more in confinement. Maybe you have more things in a dry lot instead of out on range, and that can help to some degree, depending on what resources you have. Guard animals would also be lumped into non-lethal. Frightening devices, so bells, sirens, floodlights, something that I didn't add into this talk, but I think could be valuable and that we may see more of in the future is the use of drones and things like that. And I don't think that that's too far away in utilizing for a lot of things in the livestock industry. So some of the other things that we can do, going into a little bit more depth. So with fencing, we can bring these animals in and pen them up at night. And so even if we're out on range, maybe we go gather at night, bring them in, salt them down, and then surround them by an electric fence, shown in this bottom picture, with the guard dogs on the outside. And so that would be a combination of two non-lethal methods of predator control. Fladry is another one that is, it goes back a long time, even into Europe, of hanging brightly colored flags across your fence line. And the movement of that and the novelty of it can sometimes deter predators for a certain amount of time. Oftentimes, though, even coyotes and things like that, they will become accustomed to that, and then it kind of loses some efficiency over time. Similar to that, if you wanted to think about, introducing something novel, I've also heard from some people that, depending on where your sheep bed down at night, sometimes even parking an old truck at that site may be enough to deter coyotes or another predator for a certain amount of time. But like the flagging method, it would probably lose its efficiency over time, but maybe enough to buy you some time. As far as some guard animals for non-lethal control, we have llamas, donkeys. We can do multi-species grazing. Another thing to think about that I've started hearing more of lately, and do have some producers in Utah that have started doing, is utilizing alpacas. So generally llamas and donkeys, kind of the rule of thumb is you keep one animal, one guard animal for that particular flock. So most of the time, two llamas they'll go and do llama stuff, right? And so they'll become less concerned about being with that flock of sheep and guarding if there are two llamas there. Similar to this picture with two donkeys, oftentimes two donkeys, you lose some of that guarding efficiency. One thing I have heard, interestingly enough, and There's some research coming out of South Africa about this, is that alpacas, for some reason, you can actually have multiple alpaca in a flock, and they still tend to guard the animals with some efficiency similar to guard dogs, being able to run multiple guard animals with a flock. Some of the benefits of utilizing an animal like this is that they have similar feed requirements as our sheep or goats, right? So if we're already giving out hay or they're out on a pasture, they can utilize that same feed resource, which is beneficial to us. It kind of facilitates some of the management issues that we have. Another great thing is the multi-species grazing. So just the presence of a larger animal like a cow can sometimes deter predators for wanting to hunt your sheep or goats. And so that can be pretty beneficial. But there are some downsides, right? So, having multiple of them can sometimes be a deterrent, or having to manage them a specific way, or maybe that particular animal just doesn't have the gift to guard. Okay. And so not all donkeys, llamas, or alpacas are really made the same, right? But the same goes with dogs, right? And so dogs are really effective, and I would say, with my experience, some of the most effective guard animals. But with as effective as they are, they also come with some downfalls, right? They have different feeding requirements. So you got to make sure you go out and feed them. You got to manage them. Sometimes they'll wander off, which can be a problem we'll talk about in just a second. And then they'll interact with other people sometimes, which could be aggressive or not, depending on the dog. And then oftentimes a lot of time and effort and sometimes money goes into training these dogs to get them to bond correctly with your sheep. Okay. I'm sure some of that training still needs to go into our other animals like alpacas and donkeys if we want to use them as guard animals, but definitely documented well that a lot of time goes in with dogs. Now, how effective are dogs, right? Are they worth the trouble? Are they worth any liability that you may have? If you're in an urban area and having a big guard dog would be really good to protect your sheep, but would it cost liabilities if it interacted poorly with a neighborhood dog or a person, something like that. But some older research, and then there's a lot of newer surveys that have done the same thing. They've kind of looked at some of how effective are these guard dogs, the presence of these guard dogs at eliminating some of the predation. And so if you look at across all operations in this particular survey, you can see that those ranches that had dogs represented in the black across these 2 years, they maybe didn't do a great job at reducing significantly the number of ewes that were preyed on, but the presence of dogs did do a pretty good job these 2 different years, pretty good job on reducing the number of lambs that were lost to predators. Okay, and so these particular ranches or operations that had no dogs had quite a bit more predation percentage-wise than those that had dogs present on their operation. And the same kind of goes true for whether that was open range or a fenced pasture that these dogs were on. Okay. Another thing that we're starting to see is a lot of headlines similar to this: farm dogs being taken from Utah ranches, grazing land by misguided dog nappers. Okay. Now, I don't know if all of these people match into that category of dog napper, but I think that some people have good intentions, but are unfamiliar with the type of work and lifestyle of a guard dog, and may think that the dog is not around the sheep at that time, and so they pick up the dog and they bring it to a shelter, or they take it home with them, or something to that extent. And I think that could be one of the downfalls of dogs, right? Is that they may wander off from the flock a little bit. Some of the research that has come out of Montana State University and other institutions has shown that average wandering distance from a dog may be half a mile away from the flock. And so it's not too bad. And if you're running on range land that is adjacent to maybe a campsite or a hiking trail or a mountain biking trail, giving yourself, distance of a mile or two may be what's required in order to decrease the chance of your guard dogs interacting with people out recreating in the outdoors. But it does really drive home the point that we need to make sure that we're good stewards of all our animals. As much as we would paint brand our sheep and make sure that they stay in our flock, that we can account for them, we need to do the same thing for our dogs. And so we need to make sure that they're registered, that they have a tag on them, bare minimum, that we can try to identify them, or they're microchipped. So in this particular incidence of this article that was put out, these dogs were microchipped and they were scanned actually 2 states away and were able to be recovered. But without that microchip, there's no way that producer would have ever got that dog back. And so I think it's just important that we be stewards of our livestock guardian animals just as much as our livestock, especially when we invest generally a hefty amount of money into them. So kind of wrapping some things up, and we could talk about this forever, but kind of wrapping things up, predators do contribute a really large amount to the monetary loss in the American sheep industry. Goats, sheep, they all have their run-ins with predators at some point. Coyotes are the biggest factor of predators that we deal with, both on ewes and lambs. And so kind of catering to those, depending on where we live, is a good thing to know. And understanding the biology of coyotes, kind of need to know your enemy before you can fight them, right? And then really probably what may be best is that if we use a combination of multiple, maybe lethal and non-lethal control methods to be the most efficient way to reduce depredation of our animals. And so I hope that, some of these things may have seemed new to you. Maybe you learned a little bit about the biology of coyotes, but all in all, I think that understanding to a greater degree of what we're dealing with overall in the sheep industry, or what we're dealing with in our particular area, and some management solutions, we're able to kind of tailor make our own control plan and try to put that into effect as soon as we can. So with that, I'll kind of open up to any questions. I just threw up my email up here if anyone wants to contact me or get a hold of me to answer some of these. I'd be more than happy to. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Chad. And again,
hey, Melinda, how's it going?
Hey, can you give an example of the unknown or other predator that you referred to earlier?
So unknown predator or other predator, I think what they're referring to is when we looked at the graph of our predators, we had coyotes kind of leading the charge for the amount of depredation that happens. So for our unknown predators, this is where we would maybe catch something like feral hogs in Texas, or something else that would prey on our animals. So this may be more relevant to region. Snakes may also fall into this category, and things like that. So as far as unknown predators, this is what we wouldn't exactly know what it died from. And then the difference between unknown and other predators would be other predators we may know, but they're not in high enough concentration of kills to categorize them similar to the bears or wolves or eagles. So.
Okay. Do you happen to know if there are any protections for ravens in the Northwest or anywhere in the US?
Yeah, and that's where I would recommend that you guys look it up state by state. I think, and Melinda, you would probably agree with me that, understanding what you can and can't do to help control predation for specific predators really needs to be, you need to do your own homework and know it state by state, because I don't know if Utah would have the same rules and laws for particular animals like ravens, whether they're protected or not in a different state across the US. So I apologize. That's not a great answer for that, other than we just need to all do our own due diligence to wherever we live at. So,
Right. There's so many different rules state by state. It's
right.
definitely important to know in your specific area. So, um, this is an interesting question about whether or not horned goats might do better against some of these predators versus maybe polled animals.
Yeah, I think that's a fair question, right? I think when we talk about dehorning kids or keeping horns on goats versus not, we see a lot more pack goats have horns versus those that don't, and that could be for multiple reasons, but one of the things being that they can help try to take care of themselves a little bit better from predators, right? But I don't know if there's been any kind of research or anything to the extent to show that, you know, a goat taking care of itself even against a coyote, you know, horns versus no horns. If I want to say that that really comes down to the will of that goat more than it does the emboldening them by having horns or not. But I don't think there's any research to show that. So I think it's more anecdotal on what you think is best. So would you agree with that, Melinda? Or
Yeah, I think so. I mean, in my experience, there's a lot of factors that can play a role in, the way that an animal might respond to a predator. If you have a lot of dogs around all the time and they get used to the dogs, they may not have the same response as if they've never seen a dog to a coyote coming in or that type of thing too. So there's some other behavioral things that you can do to make sure that they have that bold response to predators. So I agree with that. So do you have any recommendations related to wolf depredation?
I think wolf issues may be one of the most controversial issues. Have you dealt with that in Idaho? I mean, I feel like a lot of the stories that are coming out, Melinda, are wolf depredation, mass killings in Idaho, the one ranch years ago that, it was a mass die off of wolves, kind of went in and killed a bunch of sheep across the hillside. A pretty famous picture from that I didn't put in this presentation, but people that are passionate about wolves are very passionate about wolves. And so I think anytime that you do deal with wolves, having wildlife services being part of that would probably be a smart move. But other than that, I think guard dogs are probably some of the most efficient things to deal with wolves. But even good guard dogs, depending on the population of wolves in that area, can still be overwhelmed over time by the amount of predators. Night after night, trying to scare off wolves can really be a lot, even on some of the best guard dogs. So
yeah, it's been something a lot of guys in Idaho and otherwise are dealing with, and I've heard of some of them going for a larger, more aggressive type of breed for their guard dogs, or having more of a human presence through the nights, especially penning up the sheep close to the camp and that type of thing. So it's definitely a challenge, and I probably am not the one to speak the most to it, but that's some of the things that are happening here local. So What are your thoughts on number of dogs, the minimum number to cover a flock? And maybe it's different based on different number of sheep in the flock or that type of thing.
Yeah, I don't know if I think that if you have two guard dogs that work together well, two is better than one. But I think that kind of depends on what you want to deal with, and then also how many sheep are you having them guard, or maybe the number of predators that they're trying to deal with. So, a large wolf, bear, or coyote population may require more dogs purely out of numbers than an area with little to no predator density. And so I don't think I've ever heard, and Melinda, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I've never really heard a rule of thumb of how many dogs per number of sheep, like we do with a lot of other things. And so, have you ever heard of anything like that?
I'm definitely not the expert in the area of guard dogs, but I think it's largely dependent on, what type of predators you have and the area that you have to cover, maybe more so than the amount of sheep that you have. I think there can become some issues sometimes when you have too many guard dogs getting, at each other,
Yeah.
fighting over various things, or having roaming animals that get kicked out of the
Yep.
group or whatever. But I think having two gives you sort of that extra layer when it comes to fighting predators. So to me, it seems like it's a little dependent on what you're working with and what kind of dogs, personalities, and that type of thing that you have with you as well.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of factors that go into that. One dog may do as well as two, but I think the more dogs you deal with, the more problems you can introduce. So
yeah. So Chad, do you have any thoughts on what types of training might be required if you were to invest in some livestock guardian dogs?
what kind of training?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think I mean, we've had some guard dogs in the past, but as far as doing the training and raising a guard dog properly, I don't have a ton of experience with. But one of our collaborators, and I'll throw his name out because I think he's kind of pretty well known for this, is Dan, right? How do you pronounce his last name? McCone from UC Davis, and he is actually pretty well versed in guard dogs and some of the things that need to go into raising a proper guard dog. I think that touching base with some of those producers that do have good guard dogs, and who they got them from, and talking to those breeders can be a good thing to do. And the fact that guard dogs are kind of, like you said, up in Idaho or Montana, we're starting to see some of these producers mix in more aggressive breeds to deal with the heavy predation of aggressive animals like bears or wolves. But in a lot of areas, you may want a guard dog that is still friendly enough to catch and to deal with your neighbors and things like that, but still bonded properly to your animals. So in some ways, I kind of think it's a little bit of an art of, how much contact they need with people versus how much time just alone with the animals that they deserve. And I think that kind of goes based breeder by breeder on what they feel like the optimal temperament of a guard dog is. So
yeah, and I think one of the thoughts that I would have on that in relation to what you just said is that if you're new to guard dogs and you're not feeling really strongly about your ability to train them properly, there's a lot of people who raise small ruminant guard dogs. You can purchase them as fully trained animals, and you can maybe work with those people as well on if you want to do some of your own breeding or your own training. Certainly, I don't think Chad or I would probably boast that we know a lot about it because we don't have our own dogs, but I think it's like Chad said, it's an art and there's people who are really good at it. So certainly go that route if that's something you're wanting to get into, I would say. We did have a couple of comments from Erica, which are very helpful. One being that with the guard dogs, that space is a really big determining factor on how many dogs you might need to guard your flock. And then also that she uses sound dogs with the birds, so alerting towards some of those predator birds, scaring them off with dogs that are barking. So that's
and I think that's a great comment, and I'm glad that Erica shared that with everyone, because I mean, you think about even the dogs they use at airports to keep birds off runways, and if you have a dog who is willing to get out there and chase birds, I mean, what better thing to have than that, right? So
yeah. And she says also just sound, like playing music.
yep.
Oh, interesting. Okay, I think that might be the last of the questions that we've got on our list here. Anybody who wants to follow up with Chad, he left his email there at the end of the slides, and you can follow up with us. And we also have some connections, like he said, Dan Macon and some others that we can direct you towards if there's more questions that we can answer. And Chad, thanks for sharing all this information with us today. And we will catch all of you guys next month. We appreciate you joining us. And as always, stay tuned. Watch all of our past webinars on our YouTube channel and check out our Facebook pages to keep updated on everything we've got available to you. So.
Okay. Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks. We'll take care.
See ya. Bye.